Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such and Shannen Doherty, and together we'll try and answer the question, how do you solve a problem like mathematics subject leadership? But first, Shannen, what you reading for?
So I have recently been sent Chris McGrain and Martin McCourt's Mathematical Tasks, The Bridge Between Teaching and Learning. And so I started it. I think I'm a bit late to the party because it came out before Christmas. But I'm very interested in the craft of task design, something I really want my teachers to think more carefully about instead of just relying on what the scheme says or what a worksheet says. So I've been reading it in the hope of kind of disseminating it to staff once I've finished. What have you been reading, Chris?
I'd like to say I've been reading a really hefty book, but I haven't. I returned to a paper that I first encountered a long time ago, and I think probably maybe didn't understand as well as I should have done at the time. But it's a paper called Those Who Understand, Knowledge Growth in Teaching by Lee Shulman from 1986. Really fascinating paper. Most people will know it from the fact that it seems to be the origin of the phrase, or at least it's the origin as far as I can tell, of pedagogical content knowledge contrasted with general pedagogy and subject knowledge. And it takes a kind of historical view of looking at initial teacher training to begin with. It looks at the history of teaching and how that relates to academic fields. But crucially, what it does is it talks about a different way of looking at teacher training related to particular subjects, be they maths or history or whatever, and ways that we can focus on pedagogical content knowledge. In particular, it talks about the idea of effectively a case study, for want of a better phrase, approach to professional development, whereby rather than saying, okay, this week we're going to be looking at this wide area, it literally takes a small aspect. For example, this week we're going to be looking at how to teach equivalent fractions in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. And rather than trying to seek something bigger immediately, to allow these incremental bits of understanding to develop over the longer term. It's a fascinating paper. I'd highly recommend that even if you've read it before, go back to it because it's a goodie.
Great choices. I think Atul on Maths Chat Live a couple of weeks ago asked about CPD, or someone wrote in and asked about it, and I think we must have been talking about this idea at the same time that you were reading that paper, because I remember talking about how you've got the generic and you've got the very specific, and it sounds like that our conversation influenced what I was saying in that chat. And then I read Chris's book, Mathematical Tasks. I suppose it would have been around Christmas time. And yeah, I think it's really, really good. I think there are a lot of secondary specific examples, but the actual principles underneath it are fantastic. And me personally, this week, I've been reading a book called Stepping into Senior Leadership, and that's by John Tate. And I've got colleagues who are talking to me about making the jump from classroom teacher or from middle leader into senior leadership. And actually, I think there's quite a lot in this book that can help you think about and I think it ties nicely into this conversation that we're going to have tonight. Thinking about what needs to be in place sort of at the very early stage, and then as you move into that more senior role. And I think there's a lot of useful advice in it. It seems to be, I've managed to read a chapter every 10 minutes in the morning. So I think, a lot of value there. Yeah, one worth checking out if you feel like you're ready to make that jump, which I know we'll get to in a bit.
That's on my list to read, actually. So I'll definitely order that one. So on to the fun stuff. How do you know you're ready to be a maths coordinator? What are the kinds of skills and knowledge you think you should have to bring to the role?
I think there's lots of bits and pieces that I'll inevitably mention, but fundamentally it comes down to, are you interested in the teaching of mathematics? Everything I think has to be subordinated to that one particular thing. If you're not particularly interested in the teaching of mathematics, then it really isn't the role for you. I think you also need to, and this is obviously related to the first thing, I think you need to have enough knowledge of teaching mathematics, or at least the desire to develop that knowledge in a fairly short order, to make sure that you can be helpful to the teachers that you're working with. It's all well and good for you to make that step up into leadership because you feel it's the next step in your career. But if you're not able to support the teachers, or you're not willing to learn about mathematics teaching so that you can support teachers in your school with mathematics teaching, then avoid it. Find another way to progress your career. You need to have enough time and perhaps the mental space, for want of a better phrase, to commit to it. If you're already feeling like you're drowning under a sea of paperwork in the school that you're working in, or you're barely keeping your head above water, do think whether any form of subject leadership, particularly a core subject like mathematics, is right for you. I'd say that you have to have a grasp of the national curriculum and the curriculum for your school, from reception all the way up to year 6, and ideally a little bit beyond. And I guess the last thing I'd mention is that your view of leadership, what you want to get from it, has to align to some extent with the school. I remember at a school that I've previously worked at where a maths coordinator or maths leader was put into place who saw it as a next step in their career, and I think was really keen to support teachers with their mathematical understanding. But when push came to shove, what the school really wanted was someone to do book scrutinies and to make sure that everyone had a login. And that was about as far as they wanted them to go. And it was as much as that's where they wanted them to dedicate their time, particularly making sure the books looked pretty for Ofsted. If your view of leadership and what you want to achieve from it doesn't align with what leadership in a particular subject looks like in the school you work in, then perhaps think twice. I know that's a lot of stuff there, but fundamentally it all comes back to this core of be interested in mathematics.
I think the truthful answer is usually you don't know, and usually you don't have a choice. I think the bigger the school, the more structured such movements will be. But I think sometimes if you're in a one-form entry school, it will be a case of, all hands on deck. And so, because people often talk about when we're ready to make that jump. I think the first thing, like you said, we need to be confident in our teaching of mathematics. And, I'm not going to assign a value judgment. You don't have to be an outstanding teacher of mathematics, but just like you said, so confident enough that you can divert mental attention to the practice of your colleagues and of a subject in general. Because I think, like you said, if you're thinking about your own teaching in equal measure to the teaching of others, I find it hard to believe that there would be enough of you to go around. I think because of the high stakes nature of mathematics, unfortunately, we're in this situation where it can be make or break for schools. I think experience of leading another subject, getting a feel for what sort of behaviors, what sort of, decisions are necessary before you're in this, high stakes scenario. So I think, my second year of teaching, I led RE for a year. And then once I realized that subject leadership was something that I was interested in, then I sort of made the move to mathematics. And I was grateful for that, the fact that I'd organized, like the big Christian holidays and had experience of working with other people while still quite young in the job. And so I would recommend, where possible, have that experience in a lower stakes environment. Every subject is important. But I do think the reality we exist in, certainly in England, the stakes aren't evenly divided amongst them.
I just want to pause there to drink in the mental image of you organising the Key Stage 1 nativity, Kieran. Just makes me very happy to imagine that.
Yeah, they moved me out of RE pretty quickly. And then I think probably most importantly is you need knowledge of where to go to for advice. Whether that be people, whether that be institutions, or whether that be, somewhere online. And, if, because we never have all the answers, but if we can find them relatively easily, then I think our life is a whole lot easier as subject leader, because we can send a quick email or a text message to someone who knows more than we do. Surround yourself with, people who know more than you. And, that's the mantra I always try to live to. And I think things become a whole lot easier and a whole lot more rewarding too.
You're so right that the interest in maths and a love of maths is completely the most important thing. If you don't love it and you're not fascinated by it, I don't think you should be leading it. And I think you need to have an interest in developing your colleagues and supporting your colleagues, because there will be plenty of opportunities for you to do that. And if, to be honest, if you're not willing to sacrifice a bit of your time, because there isn't enough time during the school day, and you presumably will have your own class to teach, but if you're not willing to sacrifice a bit of your time after school or at lunch or before to have these conversations, to sit and, talk through planning, to dissect a lesson and work out where it might have gone wrong, then it's probably not for you. And one thing I would say is you need to be willing to have some resistance from staff. You need to be strong enough in what you're saying to be ready for the pushback, because there is always going to be pushback. And I think, especially if you're somebody young who's trying to rise through the ranks quite quickly, talking to more experienced teachers, older teachers who might not like your newfangled way, you need to be ready to deal with that. And I think that can be quite a tough part of the job, that maybe if you haven't led a subject before, or you haven't been teaching particularly long, could be quite difficult.
Just on an aside from what you said there, we've been discussing this idea of that you need to kind of love mathematics, or love teaching mathematics at least. There is also an extent to which I think it is possible to grow to love a subject and to love teaching a subject. Hang in there and perhaps dive into a few books or dive into a few bits of CPD here and there. There's a very good chance that you will grow to love it. It is a fantastic subject. I guess from there, it kind of flows quite naturally into the next question. What do you need to do? So assuming you have become maths coordinator, either you've sought out the job or it's something that's been thrust upon you. What do you need to do when you first become maths coordinator?
I think first place you start is with an image of your ideal. So in your head, what you want or hope that mathematics can look like. What sort of offering are your pupils getting when they travel through your school? And so you have this ideal, and then you spend time getting a feel for how maths really is. And sometimes the distance might not be that far, and sometimes they might be worlds apart. But I think you have your ideal, you spend time in classes, you spend time with teachers, you spend as much time as possible, because I know that it's not a guarantee that you're going to have time out at important times in the day. But I think being creative with the time we do have out, say you could say to a colleague, would you mind teaching maths in the afternoon? Because most teachers are quite flexible like that, and if you go in with very much, the attitude of I'm there to support rather than I'm there to grade, then I think there's a greater likelihood that you'll get buy-in. For instance, one thing you and I talk about, Chris, all the time is we don't write notes when we're in other teachers' classes. We will do, outside so that we can remember when we're having conversations with them. But the act of writing, can be quite off-putting, because what's he writing about my lesson? And I think the further we're removed from the accountability process, I think the easier it is to have an impact. So we get a feel for maths, how it is, and then we sketch, even mentally, how we get from A to B, from reality to our ideal state. And I don't think we ever get there. We always want to improve. We always find things that we could tweak. But we've got this general idea, and when our teachers are operating on that general level, and the things we're focusing on are really interesting, cognitively challenging, and niche, so to speak, then it can be really rewarding because you know that you've got this at its heart a really high quality provision for your pupils. And then again, similar to before, I think surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, and it's people who know more than you, so that you can draw on them over time. But that's what I would do if I were to start a role as a maths coordinator.
I completely agree with the have your ideal set up kind of mentally sketched. And, like you said, you need to be prepared for that. It may not come to fruition, and certainly probably won't come to fruition as quickly as you'd like. Schools have other priorities. So I think my first kind of step is to, and this applies whether you are new to a school or whether you are just stepping up within your own school. But you need to just assess the situation. You need to sit back and just watch and observe, go into lessons, like you said, in a supportive manner. It's like a fact-finding mission rather than you're trying to find actions and targets. You just need to get a lay of the land and see what maths looks like. You can't go in kind of gung-ho and trying to make big moves straight away. I remember when I started at my school, and I started as maths lead, I had Ofsted in the summer term and I started it in January. And Ofsted sort of said, well, what have you done? What have you done since you've been maths lead? What have you done with the data? How are you using the data? And I was like, well, I started as maths lead at Easter and you're here in the summer term. I am just getting the lay of the land. I will do this. This is my goal. But it would be completely irresponsible in the summer term to go, we're changing what we're doing. We're not using this scheme anymore. Get rid of those textbooks, because that's completely mad. So you just need to get used to the fact that you can't just go in and change things. Now, that's not to say if there's some terrible practice going on that you don't make slight changes. There are going to be things that you can change. You can suggest that people teach times tables 5 minutes every day or number bonds for 5 minutes every day, and then they can see the results of that very quickly. But the big changes you have to kind of hold off for. I think another thing I would say to do is to find the good in the situation. Even in kind of quite dire situations, there will be some element of good. It might be that you stumble upon like a wealth of concrete resources in a cupboard down a dark corridor. It could be that you have some really enthusiastic staff who can be your sort of early adopters, the ones that will buy into what you say. You might end up digging around on the kind of shared drive and find a scheme of work tucked away somewhere. You don't know. I think you just need to look for the good. Don't go into it thinking this is all going to be awful. I'm going to have to make so many changes. Another thing I'd say is don't forget about EYFS. I think it's very easy to forget that reception and nursery exist. And I think there's so much good down there. And we need to remember that there is a reason that it's called the early years foundation stage, and that they lay the foundations for what we then do. So you need to make sure that you need to make sure you know what they are doing, and you need to make sure that they kind of buy into what you're saying.
One of the things that made the biggest difference to my competency as a maths lead was learning about what happened in early years. When the year I learned about subitizing and the principles of counting, the game changed completely for me. I suddenly had this wider picture and this deeper knowledge of why all the things that were happening in Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 were happening, and where we could, where we could change our practice, or where we could learn from our colleagues, in the early years. And yes, I think that's a superb point, because I could feel in myself a much better understanding of what I was up to, because I understood that picture so much better. Yeah, so great point, Shannen.
It's one of those things that everyone says, oh, if you're having a bad day, go down to reception for 5 minutes because it's so lovely in there. And it really is. But you need to go down there and really get to see what they're doing. And you're so right. Once I'd had my eyes opened to subitizing, whatever you want to call it, and the kind of principles of counting, I just suddenly went, oh, now I understand why these children are having these issues. And now I understand why this leads to that.
To my shame, I probably spent the first year of being a maths lead without understanding in the slightest the importance of spatial awareness and the way that that develops in EYFS and how that is predictive of later maths attainment and why. I couldn't agree more with the idea that you just have to learn that. I guess what I'd add then to what you've said so far about what you need to do when you first become a maths coordinator really just builds on what you've said about this idea that effectively at first it really is about learning and observation. And that can mean lots of different things. It can mean working out which teachers have pretty good subject knowledge and which don't, which teachers are confident and which are struggling for confidence. It can mean getting a really good grasp of your entire curriculum, deciding whether the monumental change of actually changing your maths curriculum is something that the school needs to consider, that's something that requires a lot of thought. You need to understand assessment. Like, how is it done at your school? Again, this can be before you even consider making changes in this area or whether changes need to be made. You need to understand, well, how do we assess mathematics? Do we use end of year written assessments? Do we have any metrics against which we keep an eye on key areas of arithmetic, etc.? What happens with struggling children in your school? Systematically across your school, if a child is struggling with mathematics, how are they supported? What interventions, if any, are currently in place? And if those interventions take place, when do they take place? Who's running them? What kind of training have they had? Again, this isn't you changing anything. It's just you getting a feel for what's going on. I think this process of really getting to grips with what's going on can easily take, depending on how much time you're given as a maths coordinator, can easily take months. So don't be afraid to not go in all guns blazing when you first become a leader. I guess at the end of all of that process, the key thing is then to prioritize. Find one thing that you think is most important to change if something does indeed need changing, or one area that needs developing, and take it from there.
If anyone's thinking, where do I go to find out more about early years? I think you could do a lot worse than spend a few hours on the Learning Trajectories website.
I directed a special school teacher from Twitter there recently, and she was absolutely floored by how amazing it is. If you haven't been on there, just spend some time. It's brilliant.
For those teachers who are not sure, or those people listening who think, oh, shall I have a look at that? Just to give you a flavor of it. Effectively, there are what look like ladders for a variety of mathematical areas of understanding, be it supervising, spatial awareness, counting, etc. And for each of these levels, there are videos, brief little videos that show literally an adult and a child working together they're kind of showing you what this looks like in practice. When a child can do this, what does it look like? As well as providing activities and other bits and pieces to help you actually get them to reach that point. Clements and Sarama, the researchers and educators who have put this together and have done a great deal of research into the area of early mathematics, would be the first to say that the trajectories are, while there's a great deal of truth to them, it doesn't necessarily mean that children will progress through them in a particularly predictable fashion, but they are there as stepping stones to give you an idea of how children are likely to progress in all areas. It really is a brilliant website, and of course it's totally free. So yeah, highly recommended.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed watching my 6 and nearly 4-year-old go through it at different rates, and all of a sudden one of them will be, 4 or 5 steps on than they were the last time we were doing some sort of mathematical activity together. It's fascinating. You're absolutely right. It's a rough estimate, but that's all it can ever be, because everyone's slightly different. I think before we move on to the next question, I'm really interested, Chris, in your point, which I think sort of rounded off the advice quite well. You talked about prioritization. What is, I suppose this is to both of you. What are you thinking about whenever you're prioritizing actions to take?
It goes without saying that this is really school specific. I think it's hard not to speak just in generalities for that reason. But really, it's the biggest hole in the boat. It's the biggest problem. It's the thing that you look at and think that's going to have the largest impact on outcomes for children over the longer term. Now, naturally, that's how well you are able to diagnose that will depend on your subject knowledge. And it might be the case that you're a maths lead and 2 or 3 years down the line, you look back and think, oh, bum, I really should have prioritized some of the learning that goes on in year 1, or I should have prioritized making sure the teachers understand supervising, or actually making sure that teachers were au fait with different kinds of representations and making sure that's embedded across the curriculum might be the thing you wished you had prioritized. But it really is important for you to try and get a lay of the land. Again, as you were talking about, Kieran, discuss with others based on what you've seen, what you think the largest priority is. It might be the case that you go to someone more experienced within your school or elsewhere and say, I see these 5 things in my school. Where would you begin and why? And it might be the case that different people justify where to begin in different places, but at least then you get an understanding of the reasoning behind it. In short, what is the thing where you can have the greatest impact on long-term outcomes the quickest?
Yeah, I would be inclined to agree. You need to find the thing that is going to have a big impact, and not even just quickly, just the thing that's going to have a big impact for those students you have in your school, whether they're in year 1 and it will see them right through to year 6, or something that will have an impact on those year 6s for the brief time you've got them. And I do think the temptation to go for quick wins over the big chunky kind of meatier problem is an issue, but I do think there are some quick wins that can run alongside quite nicely, things that don't take an awful lot of training, things that don't take an awful lot of time, things that can be implemented and done quite. I'm struggling to think of an example, but like I said earlier, something along the lines of saying to teachers, do you know what, fluency is pants here. Our children have no recall of any facts, so for every day you're going to do five minutes of whatever it is, number bonds, times tables, doubles, halves, that kind of thing. And I think that, you can delve into the why and the importance of it at a later date, but saying to people, you are going to do this, it will have an impact, that's a quick win for me. Something that can be implemented quite fast, and then teachers can just crack on with it while you're tackling a bigger issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. I mean, in particular, what you say about the idea of things being able to run alongside, because when it comes to prioritizing, and like it was tempting for me to say, and I did effectively say, like, pick one thing, but really it's pick one thing for your teachers to be dealing with. Alongside that, you might be getting on with something else in the background, or like you say, there might be just one thing that you can implement quite quickly that isn't really going to take up a great deal of mental space for your teachers, but it's just something that you can fix quite quickly, even if it isn't necessarily going to have the biggest impact, be it something that just isn't joined up that you can sort in a fairly brief period of time. Like if, for example, you notice that the written methods that are being taught in years 4, 5, and 6 don't align with the way that particular written methods are being introduced in year 3, and that might be something that you can just quickly sort. That's something that isn't going to take up a lot of mental space. It doesn't even necessarily involve all of the teachers in the school. So yeah, I think you've added necessary nuance to the point I made there, which is that as well as kind of thinking what's the biggest problem, there are other things that you can be doing alongside that that might not take up much mental space for teachers.
I think there are certain things that can buy us breathing space, but I also like the idea that you've got this multi-layered priority system. And I was just thinking about there now. And so what I mean is that you will have your whole school, this is something we'd like to move towards. But equally, if you're supporting individual teachers, then you're going to have more than one thing, that you're going to focus with. And we'll get to that in the next question. So I like that you've got your big picture and then individualized pictures. But in terms of breathing space, doing some things well will guarantee a minimum sort of standard of education, like really strong modeling or explanation, or, you and I, Chris, talked about the fact that problem solving is happening and all children are allowed access to it, and just that guarantee that that is the case can make a big difference. And then so whenever I'm prioritizing, I'm thinking about what's important, big picture, but equally which teachers and what are their development points as well. I just thought it was really interesting because you mentioned, and I thought it rounded off that bit quite well. So I suppose the next question is, Shannen, how do you support teachers who are struggling to teach the subject adequately?
Well, this is quite a chunky one for me, I think. I would say, and this is a huge kind of sweeping statement, so tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong, but I would say the majority of the time when a teacher is struggling to teach maths adequately, it's a subject knowledge issue. It's a confidence issue with the fact that and often teachers they know that they don't know. And so their confidence is already kind of shaken. And so for me, subject knowledge is a huge thing. I talk about it constantly at school, and we put lots of trainings on as a trust and sort of really encourage people to go to it. And if we can get them done during the day, even better, so they're not giving up their own time. And because of subject knowledge being an issue, it's likely that planning is then an issue. Do they understand what they're teaching? Is it broken down properly? I know, schools, there'll be kind of unionized people who are like, you can't force people to use a planning format. No, you can't. And I'm not suggesting anyone should have to hand in planning every Friday before 3 o'clock and all of that nonsense from years ago. But I'm sorry to those of you who, if it's not years ago, I appreciate that there are some people still in that situation, which is deeply upsetting for me. But if you know that planning is probably an issue, can you look at their plans with them? Can you talk through what steps they went through? Co-planning is a huge thing for me. And I think because maths leads generally are in class, I would say, even if it's just part-time and they're sort of, out of class for a little bit, they've got their own class, they've got their own things to do. And getting into planning sessions is very difficult because generally PPA cover is sorted, and then who else it's going to cover if the math leads out. But getting into PPA is a huge thing. Actually looking at someone's process and then talking them through your process and kind of doing that kind of modeling, because I think to plan effectively, you need to have seen good planning take place. And I think, I think you touched on it in the early career teacher episode where you said, you need to be with someone who's more experienced when you're an NQT. You need to watch them work. You need to understand what steps they take. It's going to take you longer because you're new, but you need to see what it looks like. You need to see good practice. And I think getting into planning sessions, having that kind of high quality, rich conversation with them is helpful. Getting into lessons, seeing where they're going wrong, seeing where they falter, modeling lessons, team teaching with them, sort of planning together, modeling it for them, planning together, then them modeling it for you. Just lots of collaboration, lots of communication. And with that, I think I'm going to use the phrase incremental coaching. And it's something my friend Emma talks about all the time. She's a big coaching fanatic. I have never been in a school that does coaching, but it's something I'm interested in reading about. But I think those sort of giving someone small steps to work on, taking time to evaluate and reflect on them, and kind of having the approach of, well, we're going to fix this small thing and work on it for a little bit. And then when you've got that, we're going to pick another small thing that we can do alongside that, and then keep picking these small things rather than going, you're doing a really bad job. You need to do this, 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 and this. I worked with an NQT, gosh, 4 or 5 years ago. And in her first ever NQT observation, she was given a list of 20 things that were wrong. And they said, when you get your next observation, we want these 20 things sorted. And I went back and said, no, this is not right. And I said to her, you need to go back and say, this is far too much. Pick one. This is your first time ever teaching. Pick one thing. So I think not going in, like you said earlier on, Chris, all guns blazing, it can be very tempting, but don't. Take a step back, pick small things to fix, and subject knowledge, subject knowledge, subject knowledge.
You've returned the favour that I think I did to an extent earlier, in that you've taken all of the interesting things I hope interesting things I was going to say. Yeah, team teaching. If you've got the opportunity in a one form entry school, or in where you've got a full timetable, it can be really difficult to get the chance to do that. But if time allows, if you can get that time to support teachers, then modelling teaching, covering another teacher's lesson so they can go and observe someone else, or even better than that, they just watch you teach the lesson, they are great ways to support teachers. I agree that planning meetings are a massive thing, and not being afraid to, as maths lead, to say, you know what, we are going to plan together as such for a week or two, but in week one, I'm just going to plan for you. It's not going to be perfect. I'm just going to talk you through what I did. And then next week we'll do the same. And then the week after, we'll kind of plan one together. And then the week after that, you'll plan one, and maybe I'll give you some pointers. And so you have that slow release of responsibility. I think that can be supportive. Thinking about subject knowledge, though, it just reminded me of a staff meeting I was in a few years ago, which was, we all sat together in one of the classrooms, and we got out the most recent year 6 SATs paper. And as a whole staff, we kind of picked it apart, and we looked at it, and we had to go answering the most tricky questions. And effectively the whole room, apart from a few year 6 and 5 teachers, just openly and understandably admitted that they just had no idea how to answer, never mind teach, certain aspects of the paper. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a really powerful bit of CPD, because we're going to look at all this stuff within the paper that we don't quite understand. And then presumably next week, or at some point down the line, we'll then look at these bits and pieces, or at least the most high priority stuff, and we'll learn how to teach them. We'll maybe just be taught a lesson, and that will be part of our professional development. What actually happened is just we all sat around and said, oh yeah, lots of people here can't do this. And then that was it. And it just stopped. That was the end of the meeting, and we just carried on with our lives. I do think the first half of that, the idea of acquainting teachers with the scope of a year 6 SATs paper, and then saying, okay, so which bits are you less confident with? Which bits would you be worried about teaching? And then using that as a jumping off point for CPD related to subject knowledge that you're going to do later can be quite beneficial. I think just the last thing to mention is that it may well be the case that a teacher says to you, I'm really struggling with my maths teaching. And you go into support, maybe just to give a few pointers or a single pointer. And what you realize when you're in there is that actually it isn't the subject knowledge, or maybe it is the subject knowledge, but at heart, the biggest thing that they are struggling with might be something related to just generic pedagogy. It might be behavior management. It might be their questioning. It might be the clarity of their explanation, which obviously ties in with subject knowledge, but it might not relate to that necessarily. And I'd say, as a maths lead, don't be afraid to support teachers with stuff that actually isn't immediately related to mathematics, that is just generic pedagogy. It can be the case that sometimes you just can step in and support a teacher. It just so happens that you've seen that in their maths lessons.
So I think the point about subject knowledge is really important. It's a really good one. I suppose best part of 10 years ago, I was going out and visiting other schools, and the SLE role, the Specialist Leader of Education, and I wrote Tackling Misconceptions off the back of lots of the same conversation happening time and time again about those fundamental things we can do as teachers to make sure that misconceptions aren't passed on. And that's sort of the way I approach both my books is, what conversations am I having with people? And so I do think that it is quite common and quite reasonable to expect that there is a disparity between the subject knowledge that is necessary, for the whole education system to operate on a really high level, and where we exist right now, and where we have existed for what appears to be quite a while. And so I think that's really important. And I also think that in describing what you would do to help struggling teachers, you've essentially described my role, and so that's led me to think about my response a little bit more, because obviously I'm very fortunate that I have two things to focus on: the quality of teaching and learning mathematics across my schools, and community engagement with maths. And so that means that I can afford to do all the things that you guys describe. And I think if you're in a school where maths is a strength, maths is done really well, um, then supporting teachers who are struggling to teach, the subject adequately is different, because you have lots of really strong models of what that might look like. And so the answer might be some time with the subject leader, time in lots of people's classes, getting a feel for what maths is like at the school, and then sort of going on bit by bit. Because, when you've got, such strong sort of colleagues around you, then you're almost feeding into the way that maths is taught, if that makes sense. But I think if you have a need to improve the quality of maths education in your school, and you're really serious about it, then I do think you need to have a similar model to the one that my schools have utilized for the last couple of years. Because if a maths lead is charged with improving the quality of teaching, say across a two elementary school, but they're also teaching 4.5 out of 5 days, then it could take decades, to really make an impact, if at all. Whereas if you have someone who is able to spend a concerted amount of time with colleagues, focusing solely on their practice, then you have a really, a much greater chance of effecting change. For instance, the most intensive support I provide people with is a full term teaching with them every day. And like you say, I will start off with 100%. I will plan, I will teach, and I will explain every decision I'm making. So during the planning session, I'll say, okay, we're going to teach this. I would do this because of X, Y, and Z. And then we go into the lesson, and I would explain why I was doing certain things, what pedagogical decisions I was making, and what information I could get from the pupils. Say we're using mini whiteboards, I would be explaining, I've learned this, so my next decision is this. And then gradually over the 6 or 7 weeks, responsibility would, as you say, phase to the other teacher. So halfway through the term, it's 50-50. And then depending on how they respond, you'll normally find quite quickly they will take on most of the responsibility. And then you can literally be, even though we're both in the lesson together, we could be having a conversation about the decisions we're making. What have you learned now? Oh, I can see that this is quite a common error that's been made. I'm going to address that. And I think if you have a real need, then that's the direction I think schools should go. And how we do that, I think it's easier in multi-category trusts because of the groups of schools and the shared funding and things. But equally, it might be about talking to neighbor schools, or schools that have a similar pressing need, and then taking it from there. I don't think it's a pipe dream, because I think, from what I know of the costs, I think it is within the realm of possibility for 3 or 4 schools to get together and to share, even if they're not joined by a multi-academy trust. And I think if we have teachers who are struggling, that's the best way to effect change. And then over time, your support accounts for the differing levels that the teachers are operating on. You'll have really experienced teachers who need very little more than a conversation or some pointers, direction towards some reading. And then you can focus on your new teachers, and those teachers are at the very start of their careers. So I don't know. I feel like it's not pie in the sky, but I apologize if it is. But that's what I think in terms of supporting those teachers who are struggling. And it's exactly what you guys say. It's getting in there as much as possible. And a lot of the stuff is the same with what we do with our pupils. We model, we face responsibility, we give in the moment feedback where appropriate, and then over time we see our colleagues improving, piece by piece.
I think your role sounds like an absolute dream, Kieran. And it's not pie in the sky. It's not a pipe dream because you're doing it. But I think a big part of this is head teachers and senior leaders getting the importance of it and realizing that this is going to be probably the quickest and easiest way for improvements to happen, because it isn't as doable if you've just got one maths lead in a school trying to support colleagues in every year group, say, or maybe you've got a maths lead in Key Stage 2 and a maths lead in Key Stage 1 and EYFS if you're in a particularly big school, and they're still trying to support colleagues all over the place. So I think it's part of it is head teacher buy-in there and understanding the importance of it.
I don't think it's pie in the sky either. I think there are certain mechanisms that would need to be in place. I mean, the nature of a multi-academy trust is that, let's say you've got one school that is really struggling with mathematics. They don't mind, for example, someone like you spending more time with that school within a trust, even if effectively the resources are pooled across those 4 schools to allow that to happen. Whereas, let's say it was a more informal, well, not an informal arrangement, but an arrangement where 4 schools had said, you know what, we're going to buy in a specialist maths teacher to support across our 4 schools. And then you found out that one of the schools needed a great deal of support, or 2 of them did, and one of them was actually in pretty good shape. You end up with almost a funding race to the bottom, because those schools that need the most support are going to be the ones that are most likely to contribute, and those that recognize they don't need so much support are the ones that can kind of hold back. So I don't think it's pie in the sky at all. It would just require some kind of model in which schools were either forced, which tends to happen with the whole multi-academy trust model, or incentivized to work together as a group of schools, and to be able to say, oh no, it makes sense for you to prioritize that school down the road. At the moment, our maths is in pretty good shape and they're really struggling. So we get that. We don't mind contributing resources that aren't necessarily going to have an impact with us so immediately. I guess that ties into a bit of a bugbear of mine, which is the fact that we do currently seem to exist within a system where, for one reason or another, there is an underlying sense of competition between schools rather than that inherent sense of cooperation. And that's not the fault of staff, that's systemic issues relating to league tables, but that's a whole other podcast, I imagine.
Yeah, really good points. I think then perhaps the focus of my message should shift slightly towards schools making as much time as is physically possible for those kind of behaviors and those kind of situations to unfold, where the subject leader is given, for instance, the same amount of release that an assistant head might have. Assistant heads, in my experience, normally have half-day teaching commitment. What if that teaching commitment was switched around so that they were available when teachers were teaching maths? Because I understand, 100% that the realities and the practicalities might not align so easily. But I do think it's possible. But I think, probably the fundamental message is that the more time we make for our subject leads and the more time we find for ourselves as subject leads, then the more impactful we can be.
So we've talked about how you know you're ready to be a maths coordinator and what you need to do and how you support teachers. Something I feel like isn't given much time and potentially new subject leaders really need help with is, in terms of outcomes and assessment, what does a math coordinator need to know and why?
I think what maths coordinators need to know has somewhat changed over the past few years because of the changes to Ofsted. There was a time 4 or 5 years ago, as I'm sure you're both aware, where you needed to know what percentage of your pupil premium boys in year 4 who had blonde hair and were left-handed were age-related expectations. It isn't like that to a great extent anymore. But that's not to say that there isn't a major value in knowing where year groups and classes and the school is at in terms of outcomes. So obviously it makes sense to be thoroughly aware of your year 2 and year 6 outcomes. And though this is obviously much more informal discussions with teachers in EYFS about different groups of children and where they're at with beyond the prime areas into the specific areas, what strengths and weaknesses they're seeing coming through. So yeah, a good grasp of historical outcomes for year 2 and year 6. I think it's worth knowing what percentage of children are roughly at age-related expectations from year group to year group and from class to class, for such obvious things as being able to make recommendations about who teaches who. We've said before that our most struggling pupils ideally would be matched up with the teachers who are most experienced and who are most capable in teaching mathematics. And you can't really do that unless you have a decent grasp of where different year groups and different classes are at with their understanding of mathematics relative to your curriculum. You also, of course, it goes without saying, you need to know how I mentioned it earlier, how you do assessment at your school. Are there small assessments relating to fundamental bits of arithmetic? Do they run alongside? Presumably you'll have some form of standardized assessments. I guess linked to that is also, how do you tell parents about that stuff? Because it's something that always, is a relevant part of parents' evening, and is a question that will come up, and rightly so. You need to have an understanding of exactly how are you feeding that back to parents. Are you keeping track of something equivalent to a maths age, or are you just talking about age-related expectations, such as they are? So I think there's a few bits and pieces that every subject lead needs to wrap their head around as soon as they get in. Basically, how is it done? What is, for want of a better phrase, what is your data? How are parents informed? I guess the last thing is that I'd mention off the top of my head is that if you use summative assessments, and of course you will use summative assessments on some level in your school, what expectations are there about how teachers will then use those, if at all, in a formative sense? Because it's very easy to make big brash statements about how, formative assessment's one thing and summative assessment is another, and never the twain shall meet. But actually, there's a lot of the time where you can do a summative assessment with a group of children and come away realizing that, actually, no, I need to reteach that bit of fractions. And teachers knowing what your expectations are related to summative assessments, whether they're expected to look at STAR assessment or Puma or whatever standardized assessment it is you use, and whether they're expected to look at those and have that to some extent inform their teaching. Yeah, teachers need to know what your expectations are related to that.
So I think you've given a very practical response. So I think anyone who's listening should listen to what you've said, Chris, because my heart says that most assessment, as it's is in its current incarnation, isn't fit for purpose. And to do the job of maths subject lead properly, I don't think you need to know much at all. That said, to play the game, you need all of those things and knowledge of all of those things that you've outlined. In particular, a working knowledge of the end of key stage measures and the impact that has on your school. I think within year groups, when you look at your summative assessments, you need to know what type of inferences you can make when you look at them, what the likelihood of reliability is. For instance, something like in a VR where it has a massive sample size, you can reasonably confidently say that you've got, an idea of what the sort of the general response is across a large set of pupils. But if you use something that you've made yourself, for instance, say I made a test and I gave it to everyone in the school, then there's going to be a massive difference in the inferences that can be made. So I think an understanding of summative assessment and what it tells us and what its limitations are, I think is really valuable. And that's not to say we go to the extent where we are statistics experts, but there are plenty of places where we can get a feel for the kind of information that summative assessment should be giving us. I'm thinking, does Daisy Christodoulou talk about this in Making Good Progress? I know Dylan William talks about this kind of thing quite a lot. Those would probably be the two places, or the two people I would go to first, and then sort of your understanding will hopefully snowball. Yes, but I think there's definitely, my heart is saying there's a distinction to be made between what's actually necessary to do the job and what is necessary to play the game, if that's fair to say.
Just to come back on that bit a little, I don't necessarily think that any of the suggestions I made are particularly gameplay. So, for example, when I say you really need to get a grasp of an individual class and roughly where they're at relative to other classes that you've had historically, I do think there is an ability to use that kind of data to then say, no, this class struggles more than previous year groups we've had. We've got a really strong maths teacher. Let's see if they can have an impact with them next year. I don't think that's necessarily particularly Ofsted related. I think I think you make a really good point about the idea of an assessment that you do yourself that doesn't have that scope for standardization. It's absolutely the case that it would be invalid to take an assessment like let's say you did a number bonds assessment with every child in the school. It would be wrong to then say, I can use this to judge anything with regards to standards across the country. But you can infer from it, roughly speaking, which classes are weaker or stronger at number bonds if you've done this kind of assessment over a significant period of time. You're absolutely right that you can't really generalize too far from that, though. There is an extent to which you have to always know the limits of what it is what it is that the information you're getting from assessment is showing you.
Perhaps I have interpreted the question a little differently than you have. It definitely wasn't my intention to sort of say, Chris, I think that you're game playing. But when I, no, absolutely not. But when I think of when I hear the word assessment, I'm thinking of multicolored trackers. I'm thinking of, I think tests are probably the most reliable source of information that we have. But what would happen if we didn't do that stuff for a year? Would the children learn any less? Because there are ways that we can find out what they know and what they need to learn next that don't involve, so much manual input of information, if that makes sense. And, I've seen conversations about question level analysis, a lot of secondary teachers talking about how useful are they. So I think it's not my intention to sort of shoot across your bow, but possibly I have interpreted that question in a little bit, maybe perhaps a little bit more emotively based on past experiences than you have yourself. And like I say, yours is the infinitely more practical suggestion, because you're coming from it at an angle of what's important. But I just thought the conversation needed to address the existence of, like I said, multicolored systems that bring little to the table, and where we could be spent our time on things that are more important.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think there has been in the fairly recent past, and probably still exists in many schools, a chaotic and completely unnecessary level of tracking of assessment. Just to spell out kind of where I would a sensible level of assessment that, and I guess this relates to the question quite directly, because in terms of assessment, what teachers need to know is what is a sensible level of assessment. I guess this is something we can kind of hash out now to an extent. I would have no problem with the idea, for example, of pupils at the end of a year group, say, so in year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at the end of the year, taking some form of standardized assessment, or towards the end of the year, even if only to be able to give a relatively unbiased judgment to parents when it comes to parents' evening. But beyond that, I think there is some value in being able to say the teacher's instinct and our instinct is that this class is really struggling. Let's put that into it. Let's show that, or see whether that's the case based on a standardized assessment. Let's see if this is a class that really does need the support we think it needs, or maybe actually it's not that case at all. Maybe they've had a supply teacher for a few months, and actually they're pretty okay when you get to a summative assessment, and actually underlying this perceived weakness is actually just behavior in lessons. So I think there is still some value there. I think that kind of level of assessment I wouldn't consider to be particularly burdensome either to conduct or to based on what you said, I'm kind of reluctant to say the word track, because there is something inherently unpleasant about the phrase tracking data. But what I really mean is just, to know how students across a year group or across a class have attained towards the end of the year. What do you reckon to that, Kieran? Would end of year assessments be something that you would ditch? I actually think they have some value.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like I said, I defer to you on this, because I'm thinking there's a point to be made, an understanding that it would be good for the largest number of people to be aware of, if that makes sense. Yeah, but like I said, standardized assessments are probably the first way, because they remove the fallibility of humans from the process as much as is possible. Yeah, so I think it's less than I disagree and more than I think there's a conversation to be had around the reasons why we do what we do, and doing that which has the most reliable inferences available, for the least amount of physical effort on the part of the teachers and pupils to that extent.
If you said to me, in the average school, do you suspect that there is too much assessment data being generated and tracked? And by that, I mean the average primary school. I'd say we're almost certainly still in a position where in the average school that is the case.
I was just about to jump in, Chris, and say, I think you say this all the time, we're in an echo chamber, and we are, on Twitter, in kind of edu scene, even though that makes me cringe a little bit. We live in a world where we have these leaders and these teachers talking and saying, oh, we don't do this anymore. We don't track this anymore. We don't do data targets for appraisals anymore. And we are probably in far more fortunate positions than I would say a lot of teachers. When I talk to people who I trained with, whose leaders are perhaps not so up to date with things, there is still an awful lot of tracking. There is, objective tracking to within an inch of its life. Everything is data focused. Everything is percentages. And I think, I agree with both of you, because I think there shouldn't be that level of tracking. Tracking is a dirty word. I don't think there should be that level of tracking. I do think there should be standardized assessments. And I do think that we can use that information in a formative way. I agree with you, Kieran, that a general understanding of assessment, as in what is it, formative, summative, what do those mean, how do they get used, it needs to happen. Every teacher should have that, particularly subject leaders, particularly core subject leaders. I think that the decisions surrounding assessment are far greater than your average maths coordinator. They belong, and they could be involved in those conversations, but they shouldn't be the person making those decisions. it needs to come from a collaborative discussion about what's going to be best for your children. And I just think perhaps there needs to be a shift away from tracking every tiny objective. And I think you said it earlier on, Chris, tracking the things like number bonds being taught and tracking those sorts of things. And I say tracking because that's the only word that comes to mind. But, you know, keeping an eye on those things that we know have a real impact on the kind of mathematics attainment of our children, rather than tracking every single statement, which is hell, let's face it. So I think that, you know, your average maths lead needs to understand what assessment is and how we use it, needs to have an overview of their school. They need to know if, you know, the children in year 2, it's a particularly weird cohort that year and you've got loads of children working below, or if you've got a class where everyone seems to be on track, wonderful, you can kind of leave them to tick along. They don't need your best teacher next year, like you said earlier, Chris. But I do think this is a bigger discussion than just maths leads. It's an SLT discussion. And, you know, if there is a maths lead out there who is left alone with kind of assessment, that's probably an issue.
You've just reminded me of past schools where at the front of maths books is a long list of 20 or 30 statements. And then alongside every statement, 3 boxes where you're meant to date to show that the child has evidence in their book or elsewhere that they've met that statement. So you end up with, yeah, and then that information, as well as being tracked on a sheet in their books, is then tracked on some kind of target tracker style online system. Just, oh yeah, I completely forgot that is likely still the norm for certain schools. And yeah, that's scary that it is.
Yeah, I think that happens in far more schools than we would think. And I think that hopefully there are people listening to this thinking, what, that's not normal. What, who can we read about? What can we do? Because, you know, we need to make sure that isn't happening in every school. Even things like, it's just like I was talking to somebody earlier on who, this is a kind of off topic anecdote from somebody else, certainly not me, was that they were given an appraisal target for their year 2 class that was more greater depth in maths. And so because of that, and that was from their maths lead, and so because of that, they achieved that target, but then the rest of the class missed out on age related because they'd put so much focus onto greater depth. And I think if we focus too much on assessment, and our maths leads are put under certain pressures to have these sort of data targets, and our teachers are put under these pressures, then the kind of beauty of teaching maths goes out the window. And so I think that it's a, like I said earlier, it's a much bigger discussion than just a maths lead, and we need to kind of rein in the tracking and think about what do we want our children to learn, how do we get there, and then bung a standardized test in just to see if we're accurate.
Based on what you've just said, I would chuck in one more thing that is absolutely relevant. You know, if you're going to be a maths lead and you are going to deal with data and assessment, take 30 seconds to Google Goodhart's law, which is the idea that once a measurement becomes a metric, it ceases to have any value as a measurement, which is obviously what happened in that year 2 class that you mentioned.
So math subject leadership will definitely be something we return to, if not multiple times, and definitely, Shannon, try to get you involved in all of those conversations. But I think if we finish with a question that we've recently sort of been involved in the response to on Twitter, and the question says, where can I get some good brackets free or cheap CPD from? I'm not great at practical maths. Where would you go to?
I have to say, I think the NCTM spines are some of the best things that are out there. They are super intimidating when you first open them, and they are hefty, and they take a lot of reading, and they take kind of reading again. And I think they take talking, you need to talk through them with someone. So to this wonderful person on Twitter who wants some free CPD, look at the NCTM spines, pick the year group you're in, or a year group that you like or interests you, or that you've done a lot, read it, then chat to someone on Twitter, send me a message. We need to talk more. I think it's great going out and seeking this stuff yourself, but if you don't have someone to talk about it with, you probably don't see the full kind of picture. And I think you said that earlier on, both of you at some point have said you surround yourself with people who know more than you, and you have people who can support you. So I would go and start trying to read those, but I would start slowly, and I would chat to somebody as you're doing it.
In terms of what I would recommend, I think Learning Trajectories has already come up. It's amazing. If I remember correctly, it just jumped out to me, actually. I've recently read a few articles from I think it's called the Early Maths, I think it's American Early Math Collaborative, Ericsson, something or other. So that's Ericsson Early Math Collaborative. Get past the fact that they call it math and have a little look if there's any articles on there. But actually, the thing that I really want to point out is Gareth Metcalf's IC Maths website. I spent a weekend, geek that I am, watching him deliver lockdown lessons to children in key stage 2, lower key stage 2 and upper key stage 2, and they are a tour de force of how to get children interested in mathematics, how to develop their reasoning skills, how to engage them in problem solving. So check those out. I suspect that the lockdown videos aren't going to be around forever, so take advantage of that while you can. But I know that there are other great things on his website anyway that are always available for free. So yeah, definitely give that a look.
Yeah, and even just looking, and we've definitely had this conversation before, looking at his IC reasoning and IC problem solving questions that he's written, because there are so many of them, and so reasonably priced. A school could buy the whole lot for around about 100 quid, I think. And asking yourself, why has he done that? And even if you don't come to the right answer, at least you're thinking about the decision making that someone who's so expert in designing mathematical tasks at the primary level, would go through. And I think, to reiterate what Shannen said, just reach out to anybody involved with the podcast, because we always love talking maths. And I know that in the time that I've been doing the podcast, I've sort of let slip the maths videos about models and images and stuff go. But if there's anything you really want to see, they don't take that long to make. Just send me a Twitter message or a message on YouTube, and we'll try and see what we can do. But I think you guys have hit the nail on the head, and in particular about the spine materials and not being intimidated by the size and the depth, because over time you'll realize that that's the strength of them. They've been really carefully considered, and it's a case of finding a nice point of ingress and then working piece by piece through it until you've got this understanding of the bigger picture that they're trying to explore, because they've got a really clear model of the journey through mathematics, particularly in relation to the operations and the laws of arithmetic. So I think you can't put a price on that kind of resource.
Just to add to what Kieran said about reaching out to people, if anyone's interested in particular on things like early mathematics, in particular early counting, supertizing, structures of arithmetic, bar modeling, other bits and pieces like that, I've shared videos with 30 or 40 teachers so far who have dropped me a direct message. Don't be afraid to do the same thing. I can't promise they'll be, in fact, I can promise they won't be of the same high caliber of Kieran's videos that he's put together. So check out those first and foremost. But if any of the things I've mentioned are of interest, don't be afraid to drop me a direct message, because I'm happy to share.
And I would just say, as a fan of you both of your videos are wonderful, and anyone listening should absolutely get on Kieran's website, DM Chris. They're very good.
Yeah, I think Chris is being, slightly too generous to me, because I've seen all of Chris's videos, and they are of an exceptionally high quality. So maybe what we need to do is talk about how we can get those available for free to the masses between now and this episode going out. So I think on that note, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Shannen and Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All that's left to say is thank you very much for listening. Next week will be the start of season 2, and our first guests will be Matt Swain and Tom Gary, talking about how they, in their role in the Step Academy Trust, support new and beginning teachers. So until next time, thanks for listening.